The year 2020 was defined by one thing in the UFC: the continuation of live sporting events held with no crowds in attendance via the UFC Apex or Fight Island in Abu Dhabi. While some sports couldn't even continue through the pandemic, the UFC did, and one fighter in particular took this opportunity with both hands and ran with it in the space of 10 days. Khamzat Chimaev went from a relatively unknown fighter to one of the most talked about prospects in the. This is the story of Khamzat Chimaev. Just like the beginning of many of these stories, athletic competition was a part of Khamzat Chimaev's life from an early age. Born in Chechnya, Russia in 1994. Khamzat was training in wrestling from the age of 5, showing a clear talent for it. From the start, Chima won a bronze medal in the Junior Russian National Championships. And from that point on, he was obsessed with winning. In 2011, Khamzat's family moved to Sweden when his brother needed an operate. Continuing his athletic pursuits in Sweden, Chimaev competed mostly in wrestling with some judo and combat sambo tournaments on the side. In 2018, his early investment in wrestling training paid off and he won gold at the Swedish National Championships. Not only had Chimaev shown himself to be an impressive wrestler, he proved himself to be a force of nature in physical competition throughout the tournament. He didn't drop a single point against any of his opponents and he competed across 2 weight classes, 2 themes that would follow his professional career with 3 amateur fights under his belt, winning all via finish. Chimaev made his professional debut in May of 2018. Changing his last name from Guino to Chimaev, meaning Chechen Viking. Khamzat's dominance and wrestling competitions transferred right over to his MMA career with 2 professional wins in Sweden, competing at multiple weights. Chimaev signed to Brave CF, the biggest MMA promotion in the Middle East. Chimaev found a home at the All-Star Training Center in Stockholm, settling in with their roster of top European talent. Also home to the likes of Alexander Gustafsson, Ir Latifi and Jimmy Manoa. Khamzat lived and slept in the gym to fully dedicate himself to improving. Khamzat made his Brave debut in November of 2018, winning via finish in the first round, before moving up to middleweight and doing the same thing in his second fight. In April of 2019, Chimaev returned to welterweight to add another consecutive first-round finish. He then returned in October, and while his opponent made it out of the first round, he was ultimately submitted in the. With 4 consecutive wins and 4 finishes in Brave, Chimaev was scheduled to fight for the welterweight title in his next fight, but it was called off once the COVID-19 pandemic started to force promotions to cancel events with no date in sight of when Chimaev would get his title shot. He was offered a late-notice fight in the UFC bout on the second event of UFC's Fight Island. After UFC 251 had marked the start of the promotion's events on Ya Island in Abu Dhabi, Khamzat Chimaev stepped in to fight MMA veteran John Phillips. Though fans who had seen him compete in Brave CF knew Chimaev was going to be a problem for fighters in the UFC, no one could have seen the seismic impact coming headlined by a featherweight contest between Calvin Kattar and Dan. It was Chimaev who stole the entire show in the 2 rounds that the fight lasted. John Phillips was able to land only 2 strikes on his opponent while Chimaev returned with 124 of his own, completely dominating his opponent on his UFC debut. Khamzat submitted the Welshman in the second round with a bravo choke, but what really made an impact was his post-fight speech, making it clear that he was not ready to head back to Sweden. Chimaev threw down a challenge to Dana White and the matchmakers to find him another. With 4 upcoming events planned for Fight Island, Chimaev's wish was granted. He would compete 10 days later against another UK fighter, Northern Ireland's Rhys McKee, who would be making his late-notice debut. From here, Chimaev's momentum ascended into the atmosphere, stopping McKee in the first round without being hit once. Breaking the record for the fastest consecutive victories in UFC history, Dana White called Chimaev the most special fighter he had ever seen in the sport. Khamzat's response was short and sharp. He was ready to be the most active fighter on the roster while competing across 2 weight divisions simultaneously. The UFC bought into this, doing something they had never done before: lining up 2 opponents for Chimaev. The plan was for him to face middleweight veteran Gerald Meerschaert before dropping back down to 170 pounds to face off against legendary jiu-jitsu practitioner Damian and Maia. Just 2 months on from his second outing on Fight Island, Chimaev met his opponent in a bout that left Mir-Shark feeling massively overlooked by the UFC since they were already booking Chimaev a follow-up fight given his UFC experience and grappling ability. This seemed like a good test for Chima at this stage in his career. With hum-outs, unstoppable forward motion, Mir-Shark was caught up in the wheels and ran over by the hype train. After demonstrating his wrestling ability on Fight Island, Chimaev once again won the contest without getting hit, but this time he let his hands do the talking. Just 17 seconds into the first round, Mir-Shark was dropped and finished by a combination straight down the middle, breaking another record by being the fastest fighter to rack up a 3-fight winning streak in just 66 days. Chimaev did not end up facing Damien, and was instead boosted right to the top of the welterweight division in a fight with Leon Edwards, with Edwards on an incredible streak of wins, but unable to get himself a title shot. Chimaev was the name and momentum that he needed on his resume, putting his top 5 ranking spot on the line against the most talked-about fighter in the UFC. This bout had huge implications for the 170-pound division. Unfortunately, it never materialized. Despite being booked multiple times, being scheduled for December, January, and March, all 3 fights fell off due to both fighters catching COVID-19, with Chimaev suffering long-term effects that prevented him from training, with Gemma's long-term health at risk after the lasting effects of COVID. He announced in March of 2021 that he would be retiring from the sport, with the MMA world in shock. Dana White calmed the situation by saying that he wasn't actually retiring and that the post was simply an emotional response. Still, with COVID impacting his lungs, questions around Chimaev's return were only met by dead ends and no clear answers in sight after going 3-0 in the UFC just 66 days. His return would be announced for UFC 267 in October, 11 months on from his 17-second win against Mir-Shark. Returning to the welterweight division, Chimaev would face his biggest test to date when stepping up to fight. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching and we'll see you on the next.